U srcu afričkog kontinenta nalazi se Uganda s 28 milijuna stanovnika podijeljenih u 50-ak plemena. Glavni junak ove priče upravo je ta zemlja koja je tijekom dugih desetljeća od proglašenja svoje neovisnosti 1962. godine bila u rukama nezamislivo brutalnih diktatora ili izložena jednako brutalnim revolucionarnim vojskama. Iza njih su ostajali milijuni mrtvih, strah, bijeda. 30% stanovništva imao je AIDS, a nekadašnji biser Afrike, sada prožet mračnim afričkim misticizmom, potonuo je u beznađe. Tada se, još krajem 70. godina 20. stoljeća, počelo zbivati ono što Uganđani nazivaju duhovnom transformacijom ili probuđenjem. Dramatična priča koja počinje spontanim masovnim molitvama po šumama i tajnim mjestima nadilazila je sve dosad viđeno svojom odlučnošću temeljenom na spoznaji da se više nema kuda, niti kome obratiti za spas i pomoć od prevladavajućih užasa. U tom neobičnom fenomenu duhovnog, a potom političkog, ekonomskog i zdravstvenog obrata na razini cijele države bez presedana u suvremenom svijetu sudjelovao je i John Mullinde kao voditelj dijela pokreta pod nazivom World Trumpet Mission, koji je izrastao u džunglama Ugande kao pokret očajničkih molitelja protiv državne diktature i doveo do transformacije cijele nacije. Dovoljno neobična priča da je iz prve ruke čujemo ovdje. Na rubu znanosti. Dobro večer. John Mullinde osnivač je i predsjednik World Trumpet Mission, probuđenju orijentirane misionarske organizacije koja ima sjedište u gradu Kampala u Ugandi. Dobro večer.
Thank you. Good evening.
Prije nego što prođemo kroz bližu povijest Ugande, koja je hrvatskim gledateljima uglavnom nepoznata, kao što je zapravo općenito zapadnoj javnosti nepoznato većina događaja koji se zbivaju u Africi i često puta zaboravljamo da je riječ o najvećem kontinentu na svijetu, ali eto, smješten je kod ekvatora pa izgleda sićuša na kartama. O kakvoj se vrsti preobraćaja promjene u Ugandi radi i u kojim to razinama se zbiva, s obzirom da su takve stvari na neki način čak pomalo i nezamislive ljudima koji nisu imali takvih iskustava ili ih okolnosti nisu dovele do toga da dođu do samog ruba i da odande traže put natrag.
Thank you. I greet all our viewers. When you ask about what kind of awakening has taken place in Uganda, I would say it's an awakening on different levels. It's spiritual, it's social, and it's been systemic in many ways. Uganda was a nation cast into darkness, as has been said, from the time of independence. Had dictators, we had all kinds of abuses of human rights and killings and all kinds of things. And many times we try to find social solutions or diplomatic solutions or the kind of solutions that you'd expect in political, social, and other arenas. But all those failed us, especially when, during Idi Amin's time, all the countries that were supposed to be friends of Uganda closed their embassies and left. And suddenly we realized we had no friends left anymore. Uganda was under an embargo. We were at the mercy of a dictator who declared the nation an Islamic state and started killing off church leaders and all kinds. So people turned to God, not as a systematic way of dealing with things, but out of desperation. There was nowhere else to turn. So people turned to God in prayer. The government at that time of Idi Amin had banned all worship in churches. So people resorted to praying in their homes. But even that was stopped because they raided so many homes. In the end, people went into the jungles to pray. It started as nights of prayer, but some people ended up staying in the jungles for weeks or months. And most people believe that was the beginning of a turnaround, that God responded to prayer, that there was divine intervention and change began to happen in the country, not only spiritually for the church, but also in other areas, politically and socially.
Ako bismo se vratili u 60. pa potom i 70. godine, kako je zapravo izgledala vladavina Idi Amina, koji je kao diktator, čuli smo, izgubio podršku svih drugih zemalja, ali to najčešće završava tako da u stvari stanovnici te zemlje ostanu bez pomoći, a diktatori se dalje drže. To je poznati uzorak. Kako je izgledala Uganda pod Idijem Aminom i na koji način se može povezivati promjene sa tim masovnim molitvama po šumama?
Uganda under Idi Amin was, first of all, Uganda at independence was one of the prosperous nations in Africa, and it was considered at par with countries at that time, like Malaysia, like South Korea at that time. And there was a lot of hope for the nation. But the nation was plunged into political chaos in 1966, disagreements politically, and then in 1971, Idi Amin took over power. Idi Amin was a soldier who was not highly educated, but had been raised through the ranks for some reasons, and was also Muslim. And he very soon lost the support of those who helped him get into power because he didn't want to do what they wanted. And in the misunderstandings, he decreed that all Asians of British origin and all other foreigners had to leave the country. That lost support for him. The Western support was cut off. Eventually, he turned to the Arabic nations and turned his crusade into an Islamic kind of holy war. So he started fighting against the church, banning the churches, killing churchmen and top national leaders. In the meantime, the economy was falling apart. Everything was falling apart. Factories were breaking down. Essential commodities were very scarce. We had to line up. I was still a very young child at that time. I was in my primary education. But we had to line up long queues just to buy a kilogram of sugar, a bar of soap, and things like that. Transport changed. We had to take on lorries for transport because taxis were no more because of fuel. Buses were very scarce. So everything just went very, very hard. And the most difficult part of it was the abuse of human rights. Anybody who appeared to be threatening the powers that were either politically or economically, they would be rounded out and taken away, and many times they were never seen again. So those who had the ability escaped into exile, and the rest of the people stayed in and just bore it out. It was a very difficult time.
Na koji način je vojska u to vrijeme terorizirala narod, s obzirom da se može pročitati da je to već išlo u nekakvom smjer samovolje? S drugim riječima, nije to više bilo ništa organizirano, nego jednostavno kogod je mogao i imao nekakvu moć u rukama, pušku, nekakvo malo stražarsko mjesto i slično. Što se zapravo događalo stanovnicima Ugande od strane vojske, što i zapravo i nadilazi ekonomsku propast?
Well, Uganda's gone through different seasons of terror. In the times of Idi Amin, the army was the main instrument of terror, but they would pick up who to take away. So they would pick out prominent families, prominent people, influential people, and things like that, or anyone who was vocal. There was a secret police called the State Research Bureau, and they had turned the state house in the city into a torture chamber. So people would be taken in and people would be imprisoned in very crowded rooms. And every day they would pick out those who were to be taken for torture or for the death chambers. It's famous that many Ugandans lost their lives at the hands of the State Research Bureau. When Idi Amin was overthrown, a lot of records were found, either of those who had already been killed or those who were on the death row that were being prepared for either being arrested to be killed or they were already arrested but had not yet been killed. So the army was the instrument he used mainly. In the times of Idi Amin, he controlled the army. He made the army happy. He paid them well, and then he used them to keep him in power. Unlike later on, in the 80s, we had a government that depended so much on the army to keep it in power, but could not even support the army. So it allowed the army to terrorize the population steal, rob, kill, and just to keep itself in power.
Negdje krajem 70-ih su počele u Ugandi molitve po šumama ili kasnije. I kako je to uopće u praksi izgledalo? Ljudi bi jednostavno spontano otišli. Kako je bilo stanje duha u tim, kod tih ljudi koji su tako jednostavno otišli u šumu i počeli masovne spontane molitve?
Yeah. Uganda is a very spiritual and religious nation. So as these things were happening and people were under this heavy cloud of oppression, many people found comfort in God. So churches were filled up on not only on Sunday, but on a daily basis. And all denominations had people turning to the Lord. In 1975, Idi Amin began to really push for Uganda to become an Islamic state. Islam was just like 3% of the population, but he wanted to turn the whole nation into an Islamic state. And he began to push for that. Anyone who converted from Christianity to Islam was given a lot of money, opportunities, businesses to start. But Christians were under intense persecution. Now, a time came when the government banned praying in churches. So the churches which were filling up almost every day, every evening for prayers, they were closed down. It was illegal to be found in a church. There were very few churches that were allowed to continue operating, and they were allowed only on Sunday morning. So that caused prayer to go into homes. People just wanted to turn to the Lord for comfort and for assurance. So many homes were turned into prayer homes. Many church leaders would go like riding a circuit on one home, another home, encouraging the people. But with time, the government began raiding these homes and arresting the leaders and taking them away, killing some of them. And so it was too dangerous to hold any prayers in the homes. And a few spiritual leaders began to go out into the jungles to pray. It started very small, but it grew in momentum. So many people would go in the night to go in the jungles to join and pray. And it was not the kind of prayer that was governed by denomination. You did not seek your denomination. You did not seek people who pray like you pray. You just go anywhere people are praying. You didn't pray according to a book or a certain pattern. It was just crying out to God, groaning, sighing, and just expressing deep, deep emotions. And I think that's where the people quote that at that time, prayer in Uganda developed from just an expression of desire or request to God to a groaning and travailing kind of prayer. And that has persisted through the years. It has become like a hallmark of Uganda, that the nation has developed that deep, deep travailing and groaning prayer. And many times in crisis, that's what people turn to. And we've found that it produces a lot of spiritual results.
Kako su ljudi povezali učinak tih molitvi sa onim što se kasnije događalo Idi Aminu? Drugim riječima, to se događalo, kao što ćemo tijekom emisije čuti, u više faza povijesti Ugande, no na koji način su oni osjetili, eto, to je rezultat očajničkih molitvi u šumama, a nije tek nekakvo poklapanje koje se dogodilo u povijesti?
Well, around 1977, people were beginning to say, God has forgotten Uganda. There's no hope for Uganda. So the spiritual leaders, especially those who were in the jungles, their main message was, God has not forgotten Uganda. God is still alive, and God will answer prayer if we will believe. So many people began to pray, okay, God, if you really are there and you care, then give us a change. Give us a change. Take this all oppressive government away, out of the way. And things began to happen. Ugandan exiles across the world began to mobilize themselves. They got into Tanzania. They formed a very impromptu army, very quick, put it together, and they were joined by Tanzanian forces to come and raid Uganda. Idi Amin was known as maybe having the most powerful army in the region, but it was amazing how his army just crumbled and fell apart. And very many people believe it was God's intervention. It was not just the military might of Tanzania, but God just broke through and defeated that army and brought about a change.
U povijesti Ugande bilo je još prilika, nažalost, da se iskuša ta metoda. Sada ćemo prije toga skočiti malo možda i na kraj priče kroz jedan prilog. Naime, slikom ćemo otputovati u Ugandu uz zahvale Georgeu Otisu, autoru dokumentarnog filma Transformacije, iz kojeg potiču kadrovi koje ćete vidjeti.
Duhovni preokret Ugande obuhvatio je čak i državne institucije, no takva promjena zemlje nije se dogodila preko noći. Uganda je desetljećima bila prožeta diktaturama, visokom stopom nasilja, umorstvima i bolestima.
I think Uganda has been a country of pain, a country which has gone through one military coup to another.
Film Kevina McDonalda, Posljednji kralj Škotske iz 2006. popularizirao je mračnu povijest Ugande diljem svijeta. Iako je glavni lik liječnika izmišljen, priča je postavljena u povijesno okružje 1970-ih, kada je vladao diktator Idi Amin. Poslije Amina na vlast je došao Milton Obote.
But they thought that maybe Obote would be better than Idi Amin, but it wasn't.
Diljem zemlje vladao je kaos. Vojnici su ubijali mještane bez ikakvog razloga. Dio stanovništva prakticirao je tajne rituale s ljudskim žrtvama. Nedostatak humanosti i etike utjecao je na opći svjetonazor prema životu. Svećenik crkve kršćanskog života, Jackson Senyonga, opisuje ta teška vremena. Dok je bio star samo 3 mjeseca, majka ga je bacila u kantu za smeće. Naposljetku ga je spasila njegova baka. Poslije je saznao za druge nesretne događaje koje su zahvatili njegovu obitelj tijekom mračnog razdoblja zemlje.
My father was murdered in 79 during Idi Amin. And at the funeral, that's when I first saw the picture of the face of my mother. Never a letter, never a picture, no nothing. And I was already a teenager.
Mnogi Uganđani bili su žrtve režima. Ožalošćeni su spontano odlazili u šume, gdje su se molili za njihove duše. Čak su i svećenici bili česta meta tiranije. Svećenik evanđeoske crkve, Jonathan Mutebi, prisjeća se incidenta kada su vojnici otvorili vatru usred njegove mise. Usred pucnjave, hrabre vjernice hodale su do oltara.
And when I saw them, I thought these people were so desperate and that they needed comfort. So I raised up my arms and prayed over them. But I came to learn later that the reason they came, they wanted to die with me, their pastor.
Preživjelog svećenika i vjernika vojnici su zarobili i odveli u Nakasero, zloglasni logor za mučenje. Izgledalo je kao da je cijeli svijet zaboravio Ugandu. Ekonomija i infrastruktura potpuno su se raspale. Došlo je i do epidemije AIDS-a, zbog koje je umrlo mnogo Uganđana. Istraživanje sveučilišta Washington dokumentiralo je smrt od 50.000 Uganđana u 1990. godini, dok je 1995. ta brojka skočila na čak 100.000. Dr. Patrobas Mufubenga iz Ministarstva zdravlja prisjeća se tih vremena.
During this time everybody was desperate. All of us were losing our dear ones.
Uganda has been crying to God. Just they developed a saying before that said that the God of Uganda had gone to sleep.
Dotaknuvši dno, mještani su molili satima. Zajedno su se okupljali u molitvi tražeći promjenu i čudo.
15 years ago, this was one of the most dangerous places in all of Uganda. This community was known as the Beirut of Kampala because under the regime of Milton Obote, undisciplined soldiers used to use the homes and shops in this area for target practice. Hopelessness hung over this community like a wet blanket.
Mladi evanđelist Robert Kayanja iz crkve Središta katedrale čuda počeo je okupljati veliki broj vjernika. Ta crkva danas okuplja 10.000 ljudi. Zajedničke molitve vjernika dovele su do jedinstva i potaknule su proces društvenog i duhovnog preokreta. Sve to navodno je dovelo i do masovnih iscjeljenja.
God is calling us now together to pray together, to praise together.
It is really happening that God is bringing churches together.
To talk to each other, to appreciate one another.
The revival we are involved in now is for everybody.
And unity is not something we're praying for, but something we are thanking God for. We have seen the AIDS virus healed, and the doctors go, Wow, I can't explain this, but there must be a God up there somewhere.
I had chest pain, I had the skin rash.
I started vomiting. I lost the appetite. I couldn't eat. That very night, the power of God came down, and I felt it. They read my name, Ruth Birabwa, HIV negative.
And they told me you are HIV negative, non-reactive, there's no virus in your body.
Then the rest of the symptoms start to disappear one by one.
God had healed me totally.
And as I talk to you right now, I have experienced over 372 AIDS patients being healed.
Uganda has been recorded as one of the first countries to see a decline in HIV.
We believe it's because of our prayer, and we believe it's because of the love and the grace of God.
Duhovni preokret u Ugandi utjecao je i na političku razinu zemlje. Pokrenut je proces oživljavanja ekonomije.
I believe Uganda is in a new beginning politically.
In divine timing, God brought leadership. God began to put people in place.
I'm one of those who believe that God must talk to me, especially in this type of job I am. And I believe, out of my personal experience, children of God, if we continue in prayer, there is nothing impossible.
But I've taken my faith up to the governmental level.
The God of Uganda has not gone to sleep yet. The gospel has introduced new changes even in the structure of the government. Now we have a new ministry called the Ministry of Ethics and Integrity. We never used to have that.
Mirija Matembe, ministrica je u Ministarstvu etike i integriteta, objavila je rat korupciji. U toj borbi pridružila joj se državna tužiteljica i kršćanka Julia Sabutembi.
We have seen God do great things until crime rate drops 50%.
And there is revival, immense revival going on within our churches.
Every day in Uganda, there is a new church starting up or a ministry starting up.
Once we have set ourselves free from the sin of our past, then we need to focus on the purpose of God.
Pod kraj 1999. prva dama Ugande, Janet Museveni, pozvala je crkvene vođe na zajednički sastanak, gdje je predložila da se organizira veliko slavlje. Na tom događaju nacija se zahvalila Bogu za duhovni preokret zemlje.
In Uganda, that was once used to be the pearl of Africa, was now about ready to shine again.
It's amazing for people who lived at that time to see what's happening now.
Life has come. It seems there's a new king reigning over the nation of Uganda.
It really is a miracle. It wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been for the Lord.
We can only move the spirit by our prayer. There's no other way.
Miracles have been happening in this country, and we believe Uganda will never be the same again.
Sad smo nakratko odvrtili film unaprijed i vidjeli u kojem smislu na svim razinama vlasti i svakodnevnog života u Ugandi se doživljava duhovno preobraćenje i cijela ta prošlost izbrisana masovnim molitvama. No možemo se ipak još malo vratiti na 80. godine da vidimo kako sa ovim diktatorima nije bio kraj nevoljama. Naime, na sjeveru Ugande pojavila se određena gerilska organizacija koja imala neke metode koje su, usudio bi se reći, nezamislive, ali su ipak bile. Što se zbivalo 80-ih u Ugandi i kako su se opet svi ti ljudi okrenuli jedino mogućem što su mogli, znači otići u šumu na masovne molitve. No, o kakvoj se gerilskoj organizaciji uopće radilo?
In the 80s we had two situations that happened. The early 80s we had a kind of civil war where we had a government that came into power with disputed elections. And we had people who said, we will not submit to that government, we'll go into the jungles to fight. So we had a civil war that lasted 5 years. And that was it was very painful because when the government could not force the population to report on the rebels, they turned a policy called scorched earth policy, whereby they wanted to wipe out everybody in certain regions and then bring other people from other regions to come and repopulate the area. So many people were wiped away, killed, or taken into what is called internally displaced people's camps, IDPs. So there was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of abuse, a lot of rapes by the soldiers, a lot of killings. So many people really developed a real hatred against the government at that time. And on one side, it gave a lot of support to the rebels because people had that reaction. But again, there was that crying out to God, because this time the nations did not close their embassies, but they turned a blind eye. The big nations were there, but they were not commenting. So again, that sense of desperation led many people into prayer. Prayer became like the only recourse that people had to cry out to God for help. And it's believed by many people and confessed by even the rebels later who took power in 1986 that it was God's hand that enabled them to overcome the government army at that time and come into power. In 1986, when the fighting rebels became now the current government, there was a process of healing that began to come, a process of restoration of human rights, self-dignity, the healing of the economy. So the process of healing began. But at the same time, we had another fighting army, another rebel group now, which was fighting now the new government. And that was coming from the north of the nation. And they were basing everything, their powers and everything, on occultic powers. They believed, that started by a lady called Alice Lakwena. She was saying to her followers, no bullet can kill you if you have this power. But she was defeated, and it is credited in two ways, that the government fought her, but the churches also took up the fight in prayer. She was defeated, and then came another of her relatives called Joseph Kony. Joseph Kony had a lot of spiritual powers. He himself confessed to have a lot of spiritual powers. And he made a lot of covenants with the elders in the north of Uganda, including some church leaders who hoped somehow that he was their redeemer in a way. He made a lot of human sacrifices, and he had altars in different places where it is credited that he drew spiritual powers. Many people who fought with him, now later on, they were either captured by the government forces or they surrendered. They confessed that he had supernatural powers by which he would know when there is an ambush and avoid it, when the forces of the army, the government are coming to attack. So he was not only fighting a military army or war, he was fighting a spiritual kind of war. He had spiritual powers. And for 17 years, this went on. He killed, he maimed. He was not fighting directly against the government. He would attack the villages, burn the villages, kill the people, abduct women, young girls and young boys, turn the boys into killing machines, the girls into sex slaves. And this went on. Uganda got support.
Je li točno da je Joseph Kony silio djecu da dobiju vlastite roditelje, a to je zapravo bila trauma koja ih je pretvarala u mlade mašine, ubojice? U stvari, reći o desecima tisuća djece koji su bili, znači, ako sam dobro shvatio, prisiljeni ubijati vlastite roditelje.
Yeah. We have children, we have stories. I personally interviewed a young boy who was like 14, 15 years, and he said when he was 8 years, their home was raided. His dad was killed, and his two brothers with him were taken off with their mother. But at some point, they were told to kill their mother. And his elder brother said, no, I cannot do that. Then they told other boys to kill him, and they killed him. So then they told this boy of 8 years to kill his mother. And because he had witnessed the death of his brother, he could not refuse. So he took the knife they gave him and began to pierce his mother until he died. And that was his first murder. And he says since that time, he just did not think again. He did not think twice before killing. Eventually, killing became like part of his second nature. He managed to escape when he was 14 years and came back into the city, and he was taken by Christian organizations for rehabilitation. So there were so many that were forced into killing. Many boys were turned into killing machines. Girls were sex slaves.
Vjerojatno i vojska Ugande imala psihičkih i psiholoških problema imajući u vidu da se zapravo bore protiv djece?
It was very difficult because the army wanted to depend on the population to help them report on the rebels, but the population knew the rebels are fighting or keeping their children, so they would not report to the army because they wanted to preserve their children, hoping their children would escape. So it was a catch-22. There was no help.
Kako se pojavila opet tu molitveni pokret u šumama? Je li on ikada nestao ili se samo u nekim kritičnim situacijama pojavljivao i pojačavao i kako se on odrazio na ovu vojsku Josefa Konija?
I happened to be by that time, because in Idi Amin's time I was a child, but in the times of Joseph Kony, I was one of the spiritual leaders in the country. And I remember there was a time when we were just praying and crying to God, why is it we have prayed so much and there's no end to this war, there's no answer? And we felt led to call the nation to 30 days of fasting. So we mobilized churches of all denominations and backgrounds and called a national fast. And during that time, things began to happen. Soldiers in the army talked about receiving supernatural dreams from the Lord, saying they will not win the war militarily, they have to humble and pray. And as we were praying, we sent a team to the north of Uganda just to mobilize prayer. And during that time, they began to receive what they believed were messages from the Lord, that there were unholy covenants which were made between the rebels and the elders. That is what empowered the rebels to continue the war. The churches in the north could not effectively pray change because in the beginning of the rebellion, they made a covenant with the rebel leader. So their prayers were considered rendered powerless. And at that time, we had a leading from the Lord that we needed to bring repentance to God, break those unholy covenants, and then go into the battlefields and break those altars which the rebels were using to draw spiritual powers. Now, the first two we could do by sending a team to go in and mobilize the people. The third we could not do because it was beyond our ability to go in the battlefield. But God orchestrated it in such a way that after a successful weekend where thousands of people came to repentance, came to break those covenants and renounce them, and many of them gave their lives to the Lord Jesus in salvation, the government noticed. The president was in the area. He invited the leaders that were leading the prayers for a talk. And it was in that talk that the president began to learn about the power in prayer to deal with these forces. And when the pastors were explaining to him that the rebels were not only fighting militarily, they had spiritual powers, and giving him the names of where the altars were, he called in his commanders and says, I want you to listen to this. And what do you have to say? And all the commanders affirmed that every time they went to those particular places where the altars were, they either lost all their soldiers in ambushes or they were just distracted by powers they couldn't explain. So when the pastor said, the church has got the power through prayer to deal with that, then the president said, what do you want us to do? And said, if you can give us security to go into the war zone, clear the ground, and allow us to go in and pray in those areas, break those powers, redeem the land, cleanse the land, that will do the change. And the government accepted to do that. They provided helicopters to airlift in prayer people into the war zone. They sent in troops to go clear the ground, armored vehicles to carry people who are coming in to pray. And they went to all those areas. There were about 17 different altars. And they went to each of them, prayed there, broke the powers, cleansed the land, and rededicated it to God. And even the commanders from the rebels, they testify that since that time, they did not win any single battle. Their leader, Joseph Kony, confessed that his spirits had left him. And he told them that there are Christians who have exercised powers he doesn't understand, which have robbed him of his own powers. And that is the time Sudan, which was supporting these rebels, turned around, stopped supporting them, opened its borders and allowed Ugandan forces to go into its territory in hot pursuit. Everything just turned around. A war that had gone on for 17 years was suddenly over in 2 years. Everything was quiet, the guns were quiet, rebels were out of Uganda, and even in Sudan, they were pushed out of Sudan into Congo. Then Congo joined Uganda and Sudan. They pushed them out. Right now, they're in Central African Republic. But it's like after 17 years of fruitless fighting, when the church eventually was able to go in with the leading of the Lord, in 2 years, the guns were silent. The people who had been internally displaced in refugee camps, they are back into their homes. Hospitals, schools, roads, everything is being built. Life is back to normal in northern Uganda today.
To priče iz Ugande pokazuje doista nešto što je mnogim ljudima danas na svijetu teško zamislivo, znači snagu molitve. Na trenutak ćemo napustiti Ugandu tragom upravo molitve. Naime, gorivo pozitivnih trendova u Ugandi jest prema stanovnicima te države molitva. Molitve su započele u najmračnijem razdoblju te zemlje duboko u džunglama. Kako je to moguće? Je li to uopće moguće učinke pripisati molitvama? Duhovno orijentirani ljudi s lakoćom će prihvatiti takav odgovor. Oni pak koji svijet gledaju više iz neke inačice materialističkog svjetonazora malo teže. No u proteklih pola stoljeća mjestimično su provođena znanstvena istraživanja utjecaja molitve. Pogledamo kakve su rezultate dala.
Engleski izraz spindrift označava mlaz vode i pjene iznad valova koji uzrokuje nasilan vjetar. Otac i sin, Bruce i John Mullinde, upravo su tako nazvali svoj dugogodišnji istraživački projekt. Njihova želja bila je da taj naziv sugerira promjenu znanstvene paradigme. Bili su članovi crkvenog pokreta kršćanske znanosti, čiji praktikanti rabe molitvu u cilju iscijeljenja. Godine 1969. počeli su s istraživanjima učinka molitve na ljude, objekte i događaje. Istraživač Bill Sweet iz Mount Prospecta u Illinoisu bio je predsjednik Spindrifta 4 godine. U knjizi A Journey into Prayer, putovanje kroz molitvu, dokumentirao je povijest istraživačke organizacije.
Bruce Klingbeil and John Klingbeil. They were trying to find ways to combining religion and science. So they set up a laboratory that they called the Spindrift Laboratory. The Klingbeils had their laboratory in Schaumburg, Illinois. And then we had a second laboratory, too, where people could go to pray for the experiments. They brought people in from various religions and had them pray for a situation that could be monitored. They would have plants, and they wanted to see how people's prayers benefited or not the plant systems.
Većina pokusa provedena je između 1969. i 1993. godine. Biljke su bile izložene ekstremnim uvjetima, primjerice rasle su u uvjetima visoke temperature. Ispitanici su ih molitvom pokušavali dovesti u koherenciju kako bi normalno rasle. Mjerenja su pokazala da postoji skupina ispitanika čije su misli dovele do vidljivih promjena u rastu biljaka. Neke su promjene bile pozitivne, dok su druge bile negativne. Tako su definirane dvije kategorije molitvi.
Goal-directed prayer. This is the prayer where you push things around. You have a goal and you shoot for it. A lot of people pray this way. It's when you ask for something. Problem is, there's an interference wave of thought that goes into petitionary prayer. It's something we have to guard for. People also ask for material things. They have a tendency to mix their spiritual desires in with their material desires. This often runs counter to what is best for a situation. Occasionally, a goal-directed prayer had the right motive and would heal what was prayed for because it was properly asked for. But what Spindrift has concluded is that more often than not, goal-directed prayer, at least in the Western Hemisphere, is sort of self-centered and selfish. We're asking for our wants to be fulfilled.
Druga vrsta molitve nije usmjerena na eksplicitan cilj. U tim pokusima zabilježeni su najbolji rezultati iscijeljenja biljaka. Pojedinac se općenito moli za ono što je najbolje za subjekt, gdje ne mora objektivno znati kako uistinu izgleda najbolji ishod.
There is a great big difference between praying for what you want and what God or the divine mind has in store for you. There's a difference between what you want and what is needed. Non-goal directed prayer. This is the one that really got the spiritual results. You were open to what was needed in the situation. It averts the human ego, our human desires, and suppresses them long enough so that a spiritual flow of right ideas flows through the consciousness of the person praying.
Kritičari kao glavnu primjedbu ovih istraživanja ističu da se ne rabi pristup dvostruko slijepih pokusa. Riječ je o metodologiji gdje niti ispitanik, niti istraživačka skupina ne smiju znati što je objekt istraživanja. Bill ističe da sama priroda fenomena zahtjeva da ispitanik mora biti svjestan za koga se moli, budući da tako usmjerava svoje misli.
For some reason that baffles me to this day, that does not bode well with the scientific community. Now, I'd like to know how in the world, if a person is either looking directly at something that they're not touching, how that does not make it a scientific test. I just think it's a closed-minded position that the scientific community takes. Prayer isn't working the same way as testing drugs. Clean Bibles did do something good. They did print a lot of their research in scientific form in a book called the Spindrift Papers. 396 pages on the scientific experiments, and it has all the data in there, a lot of the data scientifically laid out.
Istraživači iz Spindrifta nisu jedina skupina koja je provodila istraživanja molitve. Primjerice, psihijatrica iz Kalifornije Elizabeth Arg okupila je kršćanske iscijelitelje i indijanske šamane, koji su se u kontroliranim pokusima molili za oboljele od AIDS-a.
Nakon višemjesečnog trajanja programa i nakon što su te pacijente usporedili s drugom grupom ljudi oboljelih od AIDS-a koji su također bili pod kontrolom, utvrđeno je da su se oni pacijenti za koje su se ti iscijelitelji molili polagano oporavljali. Pacijentima je bilo bolje u svakom pogledu, no zdravstveno stanje onih pacijenata za koje se iscijelitelji nisu molili sve se više pogoršavalo. Ti su ih rezultati toliko oduševili da su dodatno pooštrili protokol. Ponovili su cijeli postupak. Otkrili su da je molitva bez ikakve sumnje u velikoj mjeri utjecala na zdravstveno stanje pacijenata.
Istraživači iz Spindrifta neprestano su nailazili na agresivne kritike iz kršćanskih i znanstvenih krugova. Zbog tragične sudbine Brucea i Johna Mullindea, cijeli projekt na posljedku je došao do kraja.
They had a very mysterious death. They disappeared in the forest and killed themselves. And to this day it's the strangest story ever. Police are satisfied with what happened, but none of us are otherwise satisfied with the explanation.
Osim pokusa na biljkama, pokusi su se izvodili i s generatorima slučajnih brojeva.
Bruce and John were some of the early people working on random number generators. In 1997, they took a computer board made exclusive for them that was producing random numbers. As people prayed in the laboratory, the numbers were no longer forming completely randomness. They were starting to form an order. So spiritual thought brings order. And this is one of the Spindrift claims, that what is great about prayer when it's really holy and spiritual is it increases order in the environment.
Ovaj prilog pokazao nam je da je bilo pokušaja i da se kod molitve nešto zbiva. Naravno, ljudima koji žive u Ugandi takvi eksperimenti nisu potrebni s obzirom da je bez presedana u svijetu cijela država postala jedan veliki eksperiment silom prilika. Nevolje nisu prestale kada su nestale te gerilske vojske sa sjevera i taj Joseph Kony. Uganda, kao što smo čuli u prilogu na početku, bila zemlja koja je bila izuzetno pogođena AIDS-om. O kojim se brojkama radilo, koliko sam zapamtio, prognoze su bile u takvoj mjeri dramatične da su ljudi predviđali, ako se takav broj nastavi, da će cijela nacija praktički izumreti u roku od nekoliko godina. Kakva je bila situacija sa AIDS-om i kada i kako se opet pojavila molitva?
In the mid-90s, we had, I was one of the upcoming pastors then, but there was a pastors' meeting that was convened in Kampala, the capital city, by a minister in the office of the president. And so many pastors were invited. I was in that meeting, and this minister came to us and he read to us a report which was from the World Health Organization, a circular they had as government. And it was declaring Uganda the nation worst affected by AIDS and HIV worldwide. That of all the nations of the world, Uganda had the worst effect. And he said to us that the experts are predicting that if all things continue the same way without any change, by the year 2000, Uganda may have lost 30% of its population to AIDS. Another 30% will have contracted HIV and would be on their way to dying. The rest of the population would be either young children or old people who would not be able to sustain the economy, So they were talking of a failed state and how to start preparing for it. And this man looked at us in the eyes and said, our government has got no solution. The medical world has got no cure, and the international community has got no answers. So we have to turn to God. Will you mobilize the nation to pray? It wasn't an easy challenge to take on. It was more of depressing news, but I remember there was a lot of encouragement by different leaders. Let us trust the Lord. He has helped us before as a nation. He will help us again. And prayers started. Now, it's not just prayers alone, that just asking God, please stop this, but there are also application of biblical teachings. For example, teaching the population about behavior change, about abstinence from sex before marriage, or faithfulness to partners, to your partner, and not going around being promiscuous, which eventually gave birth to a strategy that has become now very popular around the world, which is called ABC. One, the first priority, abstain from sex until you are ready for marriage. Or if you have a partner and you're married or you're in a relationship, be faithful. And as a last resort, condoms. That's what is called the ABC. So that was one area. And then at first, government was just going for condoms. The church was going for abstinence and faithfulness, and there was a kind of war between government and church. Eventually, government said, let's talk. And as the talk started, a compromise was, let government support that first priority is abstinence, faithfulness, and last resort, condoms. And let the church also accept to promote that strategy. So there came an agreement between church and state to work together. At that time, the prevalence levels of AIDS in Uganda were 36%, which experts say it means for every 100 people who would engage in a sexual act on any particular day, 36 would contract HIV. But in a period of less than 10 years, that turned around from 36% to 6%. A recent research that was conducted in universities indicated that university students have even lower prevalence levels than the national average, going as far down as 3%. And there were quite a number of university age students who had made a vow to their parents, to their church leaders, to themselves, not to engage in sex until they are ready for marriage. And quite a number were found, even at university level, they had never been sexually active. Now you realize this is not just praying for AIDS to go, it's causing a behavior change in the nation that is leaning towards biblical teachings. So it's believed that prayer had an impact not only on the miraculous healings of AIDS, but also on the change of behavior. And then there was, at that time, the government was very secretive about AIDS. They didn't want even the figures to go out because they were fearing for tourism, that people would shun Uganda. And the church took up the campaign and said, do you treasure money more than life? And there was some contention for some time, but in the end, the government said, okay, if we are going to go open, let's go 100% open. So the government really put a lot of money in awareness drive. The classrooms became places where the children were being informed what causes AIDS, how is AIDS passed on, how can you take care of AIDS patients, love them without fearing that you'll contract AIDS, so that the society became more accommodative. Before that, AIDS victims were discriminated, sacked from jobs, and they felt bitter, and there was a lot of malice. AIDS victims intentionally getting into sexual acts with non-victims to pass it on.
Zanimljivo je vidjeti kako se vlada u više navrata u Ugandi, sama vlada, jednom se vojska ukretala, molim vas, molite za molitvom riješiti problem, drugi put je došlo u vezi AIDS-a i slično. Na koji način je danas, vidjeli smo u prilogu neke pripadnike vlade, taj pokret molitelja zapravo obuzeo državne strukture? U kom smislu se može reći da je cijela Uganda čak i politički prihvatila takav jedan za ostatak svijeta poprilično nezamisliv smjer? Doduše, morali biste to reći kratko.
Okay. Yeah, I would say Uganda is not perfect, and there are lots of challenges going on, but by and large, prayer is an accepted remedy. If you go to Uganda, most, like Sunday, churches fill up. In every workplace in Uganda, almost every company, you'll find a prayer group. People that pray in their places of work, not because there is a priest or a pastor, they realize prayer is essential. So I think there's been a real impact across the nation of people believing God has got a role to play in our day-to-day lives.
Hvala vam na gostovanju i na ovoj priči koja je doista za većinu Evropljana nešto što možda nikad nisu čuli, s obzirom da ipak vrlo slabo poznajemo druge kontinente i rijetko kad čujemo išta što nije iz našeg susjedstva. I nadam se do neke sljedeće prilike možda se opet i sretnemo.
Thank you.
Zahvalili smo se Johnu Mullindeu. Uganđanima želimo još puno sreće. Kao što postoje stvari koje su još uvijek neobjašnjive, tako postoje neka mjesta ili trenuci kada su one prisutnije. Ili je možda tek riječ o sretnom preklapanju okolnosti. Na to pitanje izgleda da odgovor svako mora naći sam, a u međuvremenu Uganđani su našli svoj odgovor. Laku noć.